You're listening to a podcast by Way Collective, a contemplative community for love and liberation in Santa Barbara, California. This recording was the conversation starter at our Dinner and Dialogue gathering on September 17th, 2025. Thanks for tuning in. All right, friends. Well, if you joined us last week, you remember that we talked about these thresholds in our lives. I told a little bit about my story and how through my suffering, I was invited to go through this threshold into some unforeseen horizon when it comes to my understanding of God. And we all have that option to either go through it or to recoil and return to our old concepts of God. And so in the weeks to come, we're going to talk about some of these new concepts. But before we do, I wanted to pause with you to name that it's just so important that we each find our own words when it comes to our spirituality. You know, the mystic Hildegard of Bingen once said, "We cannot live in a world interpreted for us by others. An interpreted world is not a home," she says. Part of the terror is to take back our listening, to use our own voice, and to see our own light. I love that, because so much of what we call religion has been about living in someone else's interpretation, hasn't it? Someone else's words, someone else's metaphors for God. But here's the point I want to start with tonight. Whenever we use language, any kind of language, we are in the process of naming a reality. And each of us has the freedom to use language that resonates for us. Not me, not any other pastor or priest or professor or guru gets to tell you the correct way to talk about God. That's not the game anymore. That said, I do hope that what I share tonight helps us hear with fresh ears, that we're all cultivating ears to hear the difference between the other ways that people use God talk. Because sometimes, like we talked about last week, we're speaking in metaphor, and sometimes we're speaking in metaphysics. And sometimes we confuse the two. And being able to notice that makes all the difference. So let's start with the history. For a long time, theology has acted as if God could be nailed down with precise definitions, right? Almighty, all-knowing, all-present. And it was like building a structure brick by brick, stacking up attributes until you had a neat and tidy concept or system. And for a while, that gave people a sense of security. But it also made God sound like a finished object, something you could hold out at arm's length and study and fully describe. The problem is, we have these emerging generations of people for whom these old ideas no longer work. In fact, my hunch is that they're not really even looking for fixed definitions anymore. And in that loss of the old, there is this collective wandering that is happening. And what's funny is, if you look back to the beginning, the language about God never really worked like closed concepts anyways. In the Hebrew scriptures, God was called by a wide range of names and metaphors. El Shaddai was the well-breasted one of Israel, who was a nurturing God. Ruach was wind or spirit or breath. Yahweh was this unspeakable name, almost like the sound of breathing in and out. You've got shepherd, rock, fortress, light, mother eagle. These weren't neat attributes. They weren't being literal about those images. Instead, they were living metaphors. They carried intimacy and poetry and paradox. And then something happened. When the Hebrew Bible was translated into Greek under the Empire, those textured metaphors were flattened. The translators reached for the word pantokrator, which means almighty ruler. And over time, pantokrator became the dominant lens, covering over the nuances and the tenderness and the playfulness of those Hebrew names. So when we read Lord Almighty in our English Bibles, or you hear a pastor begin a prayer, Almighty God, we're often hearing Caesar's editor, not the Hebrew poetry. And that's why so much Christian talk about God has sounded much more like political power than poetic mystery. But here's the thing. We now know language doesn't work in a neat, tidy way always. Words don't lock reality in place. Instead, they are the very things that open it up. Poetry, of course, is the very best example of this. Poetry doesn't describe a flower so that you can rigidly understand what a flower looks like. Poetry darts and diverts its language to make the image of the flower evocative. It enlivens it so that you feel something about the existence of the flower. So in the same way, when we say God, we're not wrapping something up in a bow, we're beginning something. The word doesn't contain God, it points at something beyond itself. And it points toward a mystery that is always bigger than our speech. One of my professors used to say, language is a mystical boundary. That is, it both conceals and reveals. It gives us something to hold, but it also reminds us of the beyond. And that's why I like to think of God not as a fixed definition, but instead as like a living invitation. Every time we say the word, it's like opening a door into relationship and discovery and wonder. Last week, we talked about how we often speak in God in two registers. Sometimes we use metaphor, like God is a shepherd, or God is breath, or God is mother. And metaphors draw us close. They make the divine relatable to us. But other times we use metaphysics. God is eternal. God is the ground of being. God is non-coercive love, or God acts like this. And these are more speculative, philosophical ways of talking. They try to describe how God relates to time, or to power, or to the world, or even to us. And both are valuable, but neither is final. And perhaps the danger is when we confuse them. Some people use metaphysical language who probably shouldn't. Others use metaphors as if they were metaphysics. And the problem is that we're often left talking past each other, or worse, with really bad theology, making morally reprehensible assertions about what God is like. So, what I want to uplift tonight is that the key is to know which register we're in, to listen carefully with those ears to hear. Now, there's another pair of words that contemplative theology gives us. It's called the apophatic and the cataphatic. And if you aren't familiar with these, let me just explain for you. Cataphatic means the way of affirmation, which is saying things about God. God is love, God is light, God is my shepherd. This is called the via positiva, or the positive way, path of language and description. That's what it is. Now, the apophatic means the way of negation, unsaying things about God. God is not love as we understand it, or God is not light as we know it, but darkness. God is beyond every shepherd in every metaphor. And this is the via negativa, the negative way, the path of silence and unknowing. And the Christian mystical tradition has always held these two together, because we need both. If we only affirm, we risk thinking our words actually capture God. But if we only negate, we risk falling into a nihilistic emptiness without any wonder left. And the dance is in the dialectic between the two, this relationship between these two postures. And this is where theologian John Caputo helps us. He says that in truth, we are all actually a/theists. Think about that word for a second. It looks like atheist, but with a slash. And the slash is everything, because none of us are actually fully theist. Every statement we make, like God is blank, is always beyond our reach. But none of us are fully atheists either, because even in doubt, there's this haunting trace of the sacred. So whether you lean toward apophatic doubt or cataphatic affirmation, both belong. We belong. So when someone leans more apophatic and saying, I can't believe in a God like that, or when someone leans more cataphatic and saying, God is love, God is present, God is near, both belong in the conversation. And Caputo's point is that all of us, in our saying and our unsaying, in our faith and our doubt, are welcome at the table. Because theology isn't about passing a test of orthodoxy, it's about staying in the conversation with the mystery. Now, Some of us have been allergic to God talk precisely because of the harmful or violent behaviors that have been justified under the name God. But I wonder how much of that hesitation could just be washed down the river if the point wasn't to get you to believe in a certain correct concept of God, but rather to belong in the mysterious interplay of our sacred lives. And this is where I find the shift from theology to theopoetics so helpful. You know, my old podcast was called the Theopoetics Podcast. Theology comes from theologos, theos meaning God, and logos meaning word or reason or discourse. Theology is the correct discourse about God, trying to find the right words or the right reasoning or the right system. But theopoetics comes from theopoiesis. Poiesis means not creativity, but actually creation, making or bringing forth. So theopoetics is the creative act of speaking God. It's about making language that opens us to the mystery. And here's a playfulness in it. There's this recognition that when we speak of God, we're always reaching and never finishing. In a sense, every name for God is a poetic placeholder. You know, the philosopher Pete Rollins, who came and did an event with us early in our community life, puts it this way. He says, naming God is never really naming God, but only naming our understanding of God. And Meister Eckhart, the German mystic, once claimed, the unnameable is actually omni-nameable. Think about that. If God can't be named correctly, then perhaps God can be named in many ways. Every name both fails and yet somehow participates in divinity. You know, it's like when we sing our prayer at the end of each gathering, God in us, through us, and all around us, may your unspeakable name be revered, right? Take one of the most common Christian phrases like God is love. I think we all know that one. Now, that's beautiful. But in the context of language, we have to remember that love is one of those many poetic names we give the mystery. And Caputo actually asks a great question about this. He says, when someone says God is love, do they mean that God is one of the best names we have for love? Or is it the other way around? Is love one of the best names we have for God? And for Derrida, who's another philosopher, he says there's this irresolvable slipping back and forth between these names and no place to stand that would give us the leverage to arrest this play. So this slipping back and forth is theopoetics. The play itself is the point. Maybe we're not meant to end the play, but rather to be caught up in it, arrested by the beauty of trying to name what cannot be named. So where does this leave us, right? For me, two streams of thought are especially helpful. Contemplative theology, which lends itself to the apophatic, and process theology, which leans into the cataphatic. So contemplative theology reminds us to rest in the unnameable, to move beyond words into silence or surrender or stillness. It says, don't cling too tightly to any name. Let every word we have dissolve into presence. But on the other hand, process theology, which we'll get to explore in the weeks to come, gives us a way of speaking about God that's dynamic, a God who is not coercive power, but persuasive love. God is the one who lures the world toward beauty and possibility. And these two streams, both contemplative and process, give us both the poetic register, which is metaphor, and the philosophical register, which is metaphysic. They help us honor language without confusing it for the reality itself. So, here we are. My hope is that it leaves us with freedom. Freedom to use the language that resonates with us, freedom to know when someone is speaking metaphor and when they're speaking metaphysic, freedom to let God talk be playful and poetic and alive again. Because when it comes to our language for God, we don't have to stay at what I sometimes call goo-goo God. We can move into a more non-dual way of speaking where words don't trap God in, but instead open us to the big mystery. We can begin to hear with new ears and to notice the register that people are speaking in. We can hold our own words lightly and playfully and creatively. Because in the end, every word is a doorway. Every metaphor, every metaphysic, every attempt to say God is an invitation to an openness, to a way of being in the world. And that's why our words, they matter so much. It matters if we make metaphysical claims about God being all-powerful and male. Do you see why? Because that's where authoritarianism and patriarchy come from in our own tradition, right? It matters if we instead recognize that God talk isn't about getting it right, but about getting caught up in the mystery. It's not about arresting the play, but letting the play arrest us. It's not about finishing the sentence, but about beginning a conversation. Precisely because then we come to humility before the ultimate. Then we come into a posture of unknowing. And what is the result of that? Gratitude and compassion. Right? Do you see the difference? So let us speak, let us babble, let us philosophize, let us create new names, but also let us remember that our God talk is never the last word. It's always the first word of a deepening conversation with love. Okay, I'm excited to talk about this with you all tonight. So we've got 3 contemplative questions for conversation around the tables. The first question is the self question. Looking back over your life, how has the language you've used for God or love or ultimate reality, or avoided using for those things, changed? What stories or experiences shaped those shifts in your own God talk? Number 2, the sacred question. If all God talk is both saying and unsaying, metaphor and mystery, what is one name or phrase or image for the sacred that feels alive for you right now, if any? And lastly, the society question. How do the ways we talk about God, power, love, justice, mystery, shape the kind of world we create together? And where do you see harmful God talk in our society? And what more life-giving language might we offer in its place? Thanks for listening to this podcast by Way Collective. To keep up with our community, you can subscribe to this podcast, go to www.waycollective.org, or follow us on Instagram at @waycollective. Peace and every good, y'all.